Good morning and happy Cinco de Mayo / Taco Tuesday. This is Miss Farr.
This is Mr. Horton.
I know it's a big shock to see both of us here at the same time when we're usually alternating days, but today we're going to actually be doing the review together. So thank you for everyone who has been tuning in with us since we started this. And for those of you who did the DBQ practice yesterday, if you'll please go ahead and take out those documents so we can kind of walk you through some things give you some helpful hints as far as how would you decipher things that you should hopefully get when you should have gotten when you wrote this DBQ. All right, guys. All right. So just a kind of a quick reminder, this is the question from yesterday. Evaluate the relative importance of the causes of cultural change in the United States in the period from 1914 to 1945. So you guys have one thing that most students don't have when they take the AP exam. You have notes. And so hopefully you guys figured out that we are in period 7. So remember, we were talking about helpful hints and things that you can do to kind of start off your DBQ. So remember, before you even look at the documents, remember I said to kind of make you a quick list. So Mr. Horton and I are going to kind of go through some things on the list. So you're talking about culture. So these are some of the things that I thought about when I saw the question. Anything you wanted to add in there, Mr. Horton, or you see that kind of
No,
stands out
there's.
for you?
No, I think this list is really great. So, um, lots of things to consider for sure when you're just starting to get your mind sort of into the question. When you're thinking about, okay, period 7, what do we cover in there? And as Ms. Farr talked about, what's the culture stuff? That's really what the question's asking about. So, can we go back to the question just for a second?
Sure, of course.
So also remember, like when it asks a question like this, evaluate the relative importance of the causes. They're asking which one is most important. So when you write your thesis statement for this, make sure you're thinking about that this is the most important cause or second most important cause of that. Ms. Farr and I were talking a little bit before. The number one mistake is to restate the prompt, and because you're not going to get any credit by doing that. They're giving you this question here. So evaluate the relative importance. Which one was more important? Which one was less important? So,
Right. And it's definitely good if you have when you write your thesis statement, that is multiple sentences. They just need to be consecutive. So don't just put there are many important causes of cultural change in the United States from the period from 1914 to 1945 and think, boom, I have a thesis statement. No, you don't.
right,
You've simply
yeah.
restated the prompt. All right, guys, let's jump into this. All right, so we're talking about the theme of contextualization, and we've talked about that multiple times, myself, Mr. Horton. And so these are two questions you have to kind of think about when you're looking at contextualization. What are the bigger picture issues happening here? And then what is the background information to help you understand the question? So, I've always kind of stressed big picture overall. So we're talking about period 7 from 1914 to 1945. So, automatically for me, I don't know about you, Mr. Horton, I'm thinking, the economy leading after World War One. I'm thinking
Mm-hmm.
about when I think culture, I'm zoning right into like the 20s for some odd reason, because the 20s and the 30s, the roaring 20s and then the Great Depression, because there's a lot of cultural things that you can find when you're thinking about that time period. How about you?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So the 20s, for some reason, maybe it's the way we used to teach the course, but the culture thing in the 20s is always uh, almost immediately leaps to mind when you look at this picture. So sometimes with contextualization, I often will ask students to think about, where in your textbook does this belong? Could you, if I opened up a textbook and you had to figure out, okay, do I flip forward or flip backward? Could you put the question in the right place in the book, which is kind of what the contextualization thing is all about. So.
Okay. So, when we think about the themes, and just in case you guys can't see it really quickly, let me move us around. Uh, what are the bigger picture issues that are happening in the other themes? America's role in the world is growing. Remember, imperialism, we're trying to become a world power at this point or establish ourselves as a world power. You have the effects of industrialization being addressed. Both myself and Mr. Horton kind of talked about that, about the growth of cities, the influx of immigrants that were coming into the United States at this time, really kind of trying to turn the entire country into a more industrialized nation. Discussions of political changes, more democracy, less, who should vote. Keep in mind, around this time, women now have the right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which is a huge change, a huge factor as well. African Americans have left the South and migrated up north because they found their civil liberties kind of being violated. with,
Yeah.
the changes in the New South. And so those are kind of things that you can kind of take into consideration. Mr. Horton, you want to do the second one?
Sure. Yeah. Background is another way to think about this, to sort of simplify that. So, what's happening before the time period that helps to understand what's going on? I know a lot of teachers talk about background or contextualization as the scroll up, the famous scroll up in the beginning of a Star Wars film. It gives you that. Hey, just so you know, here's what was going on before that to kind of help you understand what I'm going to talk about in the main part of my essay. Another way to think about that is if you ever watch a television program, series on television, or binge watch on Netflix, a lot of times they'll say in the last episode, this is what happened. And that's really what we're talking about here with contextualization is, okay, you need to understand or remember this is what happened before to really get what's going on. So farmers were unhappy. We talked about the rise of the Populist Party. They run the candidate for president, William Jennings Bryan. Progressive reforms are happening in the early 1900s, things like the settlement house movement, just for one example, trust busting, et cetera. And what's going on with culture in the period before this, what's going on with women who are fighting for the right to vote prior to period 7, with things like the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the rise of immigrants, as Ms. Farr talked about, African Americans moving out of the South. So what's going on before the question, before we actually get into the question itself. So, and the other important thing to keep in mind is you have to tie this to the question. You can't just sort of splatter information here that doesn't have any connection at all to what the question is asking. So
All right. So let's jump into this. So this was your first document that you looked at. This was Charles S. Johnson reporting on interviews with African American migrants to Chicago in 1917. So, one of the things that you have to do is you do have to analyze the document. And I want to kind of clarify something because a lot of students assume if they make or they take quotes from the document that that's actually analysis. No, that's actually addressing. We basically what you're saying is that I know that this quote is in this document, but that's not an analysis. And so we've been talking about the HIP method, historical situation, intended audience, point of view, purpose. Some teachers say HIPPO, outside source, and you're welcome to do that, which is great. You're welcome to do that for as many documents as you choose. You can't really overdo it with the trying to bring in the outside, but remember, outside has to be something that's not already present in a document that you've been given.
mhm.
And so some students assume that they have to do all four for each document. You don't.
Yep.
You can actually pick your best one, and you can actually flip flop it. Let's just say you decided you want to do point of view for this one because you really understand what he's saying. That's great. And then you decide to do another, the historical situation for something else. So those are kind of things I want you guys to kind of keep in mind because I know when you have 45 minutes to write, you're kind of thinking, how am I possibly going to be able to do HIP with this for all 5 documents and then get everything together? So just know, focus in on your strongest skill, and you should be great.
Yeah, and I
All
think
right.
that's a really great point about don't freak out that you have to have all four of these in order to get it. Any one of those is your
Mm-hmm.
option. And I,
Right.
I would also say I agree completely. Do not quote from the documents. Talk about the ideas in the documents and use the document to support what your argument is. Recopying, especially in 45 minutes, you're really not even writing for the full 45 minutes. So copying from the document's not going to get you a whole lot of credit. If it's not going to get any credit, actually. So
Right. All right. So we kind of came up with some things that we hoped you guys would have noticed when you read the document. So I'm going to do the historical situation. Just automatically, 1917 Chicago. I thought about, the Great Migration. I also thought about the fact that this was the United States entrance into World War I, and so there was a lot of job opportunities that were going to be made available because of the fact that many people had went into the draft. And so now you have people who are moving from the South up north into areas like Chicago, which is very highly industrialized, and just kind of talking about the fact that, and I got that, and that basically kind of stood out to me, especially when you got to that last sentence where they were talking about the payment amount and things like that. So again, that's automatically what I thought about when I'm going to write about the historical situation if I was going to explain this. The intended audience. kind of, if you're looking at interviews, I kind of thought about, this was probably going to be designated towards other African Americans to try to encourage them to kind of move up north, especially for those who still maybe have family members that are still living down south. Like, hey, if you move up north, these are the opportunities that you have. The excitement. You can make more money. Look at what we're doing. Higher wages. All of these things are kind of urging people. So those are kind of like the pull factors of trying to get people to come up into North for job opportunities. And it could be even just immigrants, period. Not just African Americans, but, immigrants, period. Those people who are just kind of coming into the nation. Like, where do we go? Where do we settle? Oh, yeah, we need to kind of go over into these areas where the job market is more open so that, we can make these wages that we're making.
Right. So point of view, can you move the screen? We're actually blocking the answers there.
Sure. Sorry.
So move us the video. I don't know if we can move that. So
how are we?
We're still over in that corner. That's okay. So point of view of this one, it identifies the Great Migration being caused by higher wages. This, if you read through the document, it talks about that several times in here, that there's money to be made. This is why people are leaving the North. It also talks about how it's mostly men. A couple times it mentions that in the document here. And the purpose of this, it's a report. So you'd assume that, and it doesn't tell us where this is being reported. So, but this person's reporting on interviews that he's had with migrants, so he's sort of informing the public. This might have been for a newspaper article or something like that. Why is it that people are leaving the South and coming to the North? Might be part of the reason, and he's explaining the reason here, which is really wages, which it comes back to a couple of times in the document, right? Higher wages. They talk about specific numbers at the bottom here. Life is better in the North than it was in the South as well. So.
Okay. All right. So if you guys were looking at some of the things, kind of go back through and kind of make notes. And don't forget, you do have the ability to make notes on, when you print this out for the purposes of writing your essay, that you can actually print this information out and kind of take notes and decide which one you're really going to use as far as your thesis statement. Remember, everything needs to relate back to your thesis statement and kind of helping with the argumentation from the thesis statement. All right. So this is your second document. Remember, we said that sometimes documents can be political cartoons. We said that they can be, different things like passages like we just read, news articles. So remember, we gave you the advice of make sure that you read everything within your political cartoons. Look at all the notes, all the little drawings off to the side, any wording. And of course, it's called Close the Gate. This was something, so basically kind of look at it that way. I think if I can close our video off, maybe perhaps we're going to kind of disappear for a minute, but you can still hear us. So the historical situation, what I get here is, this is going to be the beginnings of the Red Scare, especially with the result of the Palmer raids. Kind of think about the time after the war, how people were a little bit more distrusting, especially of immigrants, really kind of talking about the rise of communism, kind of looking at what was happening over in Russia when they pulled out of World War I, and really kind of force the United States to put more restrictions into our immigration policies. So that kind of goes into number 2 with the intended audience. Really, when I say natural born citizens, I'm talking about those individuals who have, they were born and bred in America. They have been here for quite some time, and they honestly really want to kind of bring back those feelings of nativism. And we kind of talked about that too, about nativist feelings had never kind of went away, but they're going to really become more so in the forefront, especially during that first initial Red Scare. You're going to have a lot of people that do not want immigrants coming here because of everything that has went down within World War I, and also to kind of stop that threat of communism.
Yeah, and the Tribune, if you know anything about the sourcing, the Tribune traditionally is a conservative paper. So just thinking about that alone, if you knew anything about that, you could assume that this is probably coming from a more traditional conservative perspective, which it is. Of course, the point of view is that immigrants are a threat to the United States. In fact, they're labeled undesirable. The little package that the rolled looks like the rolled up bed that this person's carrying. They're potentially violent violent. You can tell that by the bomb that's the head with the lit fuse. So of course they're trying to portray immigrants as being a threat to the United States in some way. Or multiple ways. And then the purpose is to encourage restrictions on immigration to be put into place. So thinking about, the document before was all about here's reasons why people migrated to the cities. This is sort of here's why we don't want people to migrate to the United States, at least in this case, to the United States. So you might think also down the road in the 1920s, there's going to be a series of laws that restrict immigration to the U.S., which it sort of goes along with what this cartoonist is trying to suggest for us. So again, as Ms. Farr mentioned before, we have to connect this back to our question, right? Which is what caused culture to change in the time period that we're talking about. So we had the Great Migration in the last slide, which, one impact of that might be the Harlem Renaissance. In this case, we have people that are opposing immigration. What might be some cultural things that were examples of that, something to think about.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the next document here. Really kind of, this is a Fannie Hurst article here, kind of talking about the place of a woman, and really kind of looking at that. So again, we're looking at the HIP method, looking at the New York Times, the fact that this article has been written by a woman, is written in 1923. So that can kind of give you some helpful hints. So again, so that we make sure that we can see, I'm going to disappear for just a second. All right, so the historical situation, kind of talking about the changing culture of women since World War I, thinking about the fact that by this time women now have the right to vote. They're no longer kind of looking at the ideas of the Republican motherhood kind of thing, the old Victorian ways, the traditional ways that, kind of having the home and, being there with the children. They're looking at their new roles, the role of the flapper woman, the fact that she can, the fact that they said they get the, she can get the most service and get the most out of her life. So remember that during the 20s, that's when a lot of people really were embracing life. They were really kind of thinking about their goals. They were really kind of wanting to really enjoy life, more leisure time. That's really going to become evident, especially during that time. Your intended audience is definitely going to be women, but also too, I think they're also speaking out to men too. Really kind of thinking about the fact that a woman is smart no matter whether she's in the kitchen or whether she is out in the workplace, and don't kind of take her for granted. Really kind of think about the role, and really kind of speaking to women about the fact of how they came out of the kitchen and they stepped into those jobs that men had the men had to abandon because they were fighting in the war. So kind of think about your strength as a woman and how you don't have to actually do that in order for you can you don't actually have to do that so that you can consider yourself to be a woman kind of thing. Really kind of make sure that you know what your role is and how where your strength is coming from.
Yeah, and the point of view, I mean, Ms. Farr kind of hit on this, and so sometimes when you do the HIP, you're kind of some of these a little overlap at least a little bit. So the point of view, of course, is that women should have more opportunities than just being a housewife. That's what she's talking about here. And Fannie Hurst was a very famous author in the early 20th century, woman's author, and she was very supportive of things like feminism and civil rights. So it's not surprising that she's making the statement here that a woman's place is where she can give the most service and get the most out of life. So this makes me think of women working in settlement houses before in the progressive era and being involved in the reform movements of that era. And the purpose is she's advocating here for people to reconsider their views about what the role of women is supposed to be. So as she says here, it's not inevitable that a woman should be in the kitchen or at the front door waiting for their husband to come home and cooking, that there's much more than that for women. And as Ms. Farr mentioned, I mean, we're talking about a pretty drastic change in the role of women as a result of the 19th Amendment, where women get the right to vote, and you have the flappers that are challenging the old traditional sort of views of what the role of women is supposed to be.
All right, awesome. So hopefully these are some things that you kind of thought about as you were kind of going through this. I mean, automatically I would have thought like flappers that would have been my first thing to do.
Yeah,
All
me
right.
too.
So next document we have is document 4, John Dewey talking about the public and its problems in 1927. Really kind of talking about the era of prosperity may not be enduring, and really kind of looking at that. So here are some things that we hoped you would have pulled from there. So his situation, I'd like to think about the idea that the 1920s was a decade of unprecedented prosperity, really kind of thinking about the stock market, the access to easy credit, consumerism. I put in the rise of earnings generated more disposable income for the purchase of consumer goods, really kind of talking about how people now had access or the ability to do things that they had not been able to do prior to this time because of the fact that people were the second industrial revolution, and how people were just kind of embracing that. So who would be, in my opinion, the attended audience? Participants of new consumerism, kind of talking, looking at the elements, and just really kind of talking about the fact that while these people are looking at this, that you can still kind of divert their attention back to the issue at hand, politics, and that's what he's really kind of embracing in this one.
Yeah. And his point of view seems to be that people are not paying attention to politics anymore because they're so absorbed in this whole idea of consumerism. And he actually mentions, the movie and the radio and cheap reading, which is a reference to paperback books, most likely, and the car. He's talking about how people are spending a lot of time focusing on that. And so again, we're thinking about culture and what changed culture. And this certainly is a big part of that. The rise of mass culture, as I'm sure your teachers have talked about or taught you about during the course of teaching AP US history. So that's really what he's referencing here. And his purpose is to encourage the idea that, people can also think about democratic government, which can survive in this situation, because that's really what the essence of his of this report was really all about. And Dewey was a very well-known education reformer from that period, and he advocated, a different form of education, learning by doing, as opposed to simple memorization. So he's sort of analyzing this whole impact on American culture of, there's all these things to buy, and people don't want to talk about politics, but they want to talk about the newest radio or the movie that they went to see, or those kinds of things. So in a sense, he may be lamenting that a little bit too.
I think was a good, when you were talking about the point of view and the purpose and everything, automatically what popped in my mind, if I was thinking about how people, when he was describing how people were more focused in on kind of like the movies and the actresses and things, I thought about those scenes in The Great Gatsby, especially like the party scenes,
Yep.
and just how they were talking about how this guy would throw these parties and people would just show up, and that was just, they just wanted to party. And that's automatically what I think when you think about the Roaring Twenties, that was that decade where they did do a lot of that.
Yeah, and think about The Great Gatsby. Those of you that read it, you realize by the end of the book that he's not celebrating this kind of lifestyle. He's kind of pointing out how empty all these people are. That people are sort of devoid of depth, as kind of the ultimate moral of the story with The Great Gatsby, as we find out he really isn't even all that great by the end of the film or the book, whichever one you experienced. So.
All right. So our last document that we have is document 5 by President FDR, the opening at the Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA. Really kind of speaks a lot. So we're looking at 1939. So clearly, if you're looking at the dates, we have now hit into the Great Depression. We've kind of went through the first cycle of it. So here's what I thought. The situation, we're now dealing with the New Deal. We're talking about the New Deal and how it expanded the size and scope of the federal government considerably, and fundamentally, and in doing so, fundamentally reshaped American political culture around the principle that the government is responsible for its citizens' welfare. So, kind of talking about art. And what I also got from this was the fact that he was really like trying to find some good in the situation that was happening. Like, even though we were going through a dire situation with the Great Depression, trying to kind of bring something out of it. that people can actually enjoy. So that's what I kind of looked at especially when I saw that atmosphere of peace. As far as the intended audience, he's talking to the American people because he basically says that, this is something that has always belonged to the people. So he's talking to everyone. He's not specifically looking at political parties. He is basically looking at everyone as a whole. And he's also looking at people who are critics of the New Deal program to say, hey, look, this is working. This is something that came out of what you guys kind of admonished at first. Look at the good that it's doing. It's one of the great projects that we've been working on, and kind of talking about the effectiveness of the New Deal program and how it's working and how it's kind of raising the spirits of America as we're kind of plowing through the Great Depression.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. And I would say for a point of view, artistic freedom is an important part of democratic government. He sort of re-celebrates that a couple of times in here. The essential place is the way he refers to it in the second, at the last line of the second paragraph there. And yeah, he's definitely defending his program, right? The Federal Art Project, which is hired artists to paint murals on public buildings, for example. So the purpose is celebrating the arts, artistic achievements of the New Deal, art as an important part of the American tradition. And of course, he's speaking to people that are attending the opening of a new art museum. So you'd expect him to, to tailor his remarks towards people that are supportive of the arts, which is kind of what he's doing here as well. And he's celebrating the opening of the Museum of Modern Art, which will continue to celebrate that angle or that part of democracy, essentially.
All right, guys. So what does this all mean now? So, again, this is how we hipped it. You may have found something else within the documents. So let's kind of talk about argument. I'm going to let Mr. Horton kind of take this over and kind of see where you guys were kind of going with this. Go ahead.
So I was thinking, if I was a student writing this essay, now I've gone through and thought about the sourcing for each one of the documents, and like, now what do I do? So the first line there is sort of rewriting the question. The question is, what were the causes of cultural change? But really, what the question is which one's the most important, right? The relative importance of those. So I just jotted down for myself, okay, these are the things that sort of were referred to in each of the documents. So Doc 1 was definitely about the Great Migration, the historical situation that Ms. Farr talked about with that one. That's the role of African Americans in American life as they come to the northern cities, the birth of the Harlem Renaissance and the revival of culture. So I have to decide then for myself, was that the most important one? Is that going to be my argument? Maybe not, but maybe. It just depends. And then Doc 2, so again, I just kind of listed out the documents here. Doc 2 is the one about immigration and nativism. Doc 3 is about women. Doc 4 is about technological changes and consumerism. And then Doc 5 is about government role in all of this kind of thing. So now when I'm putting together my argument, and here are my docs, I know what I have to have. I have to include these, but now I have to think about, well, which one do I think are the most important? How might I group these documents? How can I start putting together my argument? And a little hint is to make sure that you let the documents drive your argument. It'll make it a lot easier to write, especially in a short time frame, a document-based question. So once you get through reading through the documents, what I would do is just kind of make a list of them for myself and think, okay, where do I go from here?
Yeah, right. And I think that's a good point. And I'm noticing that we're getting a lot of questions on Twitter where students want us to give you an example of a thesis. And here's how I respond to a thesis. If I give you an example of a thesis, then that's actually my thesis statement and not necessarily your thesis statement. And I want you guys to be able to have the ability to respond to the question in the way that is going to be more comfortable for you. So that is why we don't give examples for thesis statements. We can kind of give you an idea because everybody is going to think about this from a different point, a different aspect. And that's how, like Mr. Horton, he went through and he said, this is what I found when I looked through the documents. I may look through the documents and look at something completely different. I may find something different. So don't get caught up on what should, how did the thesis statement look for this particular question? Every student will have a different type of thesis statement, but the main thing is as Mr. Horton put, you have to utilize the documents and make the documents work for your argument and not arrange everything around the documents. A lot of students run into trouble with that because they feel like, oh, my thesis statement is going to come after I read the documents. No, it should actually enhance whatever it is that you're writing. It's not the focus. It's just enhancement. Remember, documents are a source for you.
Right. So,
Okay.
so really what they're asking you to do here is to make an argument. Which one do you think is the most significant? So, one student might say, well, I think the changes that are happening for groups that are traditionally excluded from America are the most important. And you might pick out some documents that help to support that. But somebody else might say, no, 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 it's all about economic and technological changes and the consumerism that happens in the period. That's the thing that's really driving all of that, which might force you to go back and look at those documents in a little different way. So
Right.
there's lots of different answers to this question is really what Ms.
Yes.
Barr is saying. So
Right. And then there was another question. I don't know if you want to talk on this one. Another student wanted to know how many sentences should they write for each document to describe the content for their body paragraphs.
So for me, the more analysis, the better, right? So the less you don't want to describe. Well, document 2 is a cartoon that shows it shows a person coming through a gate. We don't really need to have a description of the document. What would be a better use of your time would be to use it to support your argument that traditional Americans supported limitations on immigration as exemplified in document 2. Might be a better way of using that than giving us a lot of description. Of the docs. I mean, the people that are looking at this are going to be very familiar with what the documents say.
Right. And then, of course, students are still kind of thinking about the fact of, how many documents should we use HIP in, all of them. Remember what your directions say and what it told you when it set it up. And remember, it said that you must do 4 documents, and then it said that you must analyze 2. So before you get started, if you want to do HIP for all documents, you're welcome to do so. But my other recommendation is if there's a document in there and you have no clue what it says or no idea what to do with it, leave it alone.
Yep.
And focus on the documents that you do know about, that you do have that information for. That'll actually help you out more so than trying to bring in this document and then your argument it's not whatever you're writing, your arguments for this document doesn't actually go towards what it is that you're basically saying your thesis statement. So you guys are asking some really great, awesome questions. And just remember when we talked about it, when you're doing HIP, you do not have to do every single part of HIP for every single document. So
Right.
if you feel comfortable with purpose and you want to do purpose for each document, do purpose for each document. If you want to try to do historical situation, by all means, make sure that you do the historical situation, but you don't have to do all elements of HIP in order to do that. Do the one that you feel most comfortable with, that you know that, okay, I'm solid in this. I know I can definitely do this for all documents. And so, like I said, sometimes you may switch it up. Sometimes you may think, I can't do purpose for this document. I don't understand it, but you know what? I can honestly get the point of view that the author is trying to do.
Right. Yeah.
All right.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's so think about if you go back or you're watching this video for a second time, we're giving you 4 different possible answers for analysis for each of those documents as we went through each one. So, you definitely don't have to have them all. And that idea, that point, about leaving a document out, that's huge. If I'm reading this and I have no idea what to do with that Franklin Roosevelt document, leave it alone. Use the other 4 documents and focus on those, and don't let yourself get tripped up too much by any one particular document. So
Okay. All right. Continuing on. All right. So again, kind of remembering the fact that you have to have those 2 outside pieces. And there was a question that just actually popped up on Twitter where it kind of asks a question about how and where should you add outside information and where would you add in historical context? You can add in outside information in the paragraphs in each paragraph that you write, with the exception of the first paragraph, because that's your opening and that's where you're going to bring in your thesis. So you can actually bring in your paragraphs. You can actually add into your outside information and your historical context at the end of each paragraph, or kind of put it in there. Just again, make sure that it makes sense and that it's actually flowing with what you're saying. So these are just some examples. They're not all the examples, again,
yeah.
of what some outside information that you can pull in.
And
Prohibition. popular heroes in the 20s, movie stars, sports figures. You can talk about the Great Depression. You can talk about the impact of the wars on culture, World War I and World War II. You can definitely, if you want to bring in the Red Scare, especially from when you're looking at that political cartoon, kind of bring that in there and kind of talk about the impact that it would have and how it would lead to stricter immigration policies. And if you even knew of some of those immigration policies, that's a definite outside piece of information. You know why? Because there is no document in there that says that.
Right.
So you definitely need to kind of think about those things.
Like the quota acts, for example. Sure. Yeah. Outside information, I think the other thing to keep in mind is that it has to connect to your argument. You can't just, drop names in the middle of things. And, you want to show that you know what it is, but you also want to show that you understand how it connects. So to use the example Ms. Farr was talking about, if you mention the quota acts in the 1920s that limited immigration, and, that's a nice piece of outside information. So, and try to get things that are not in the documents at all. So think about some things that were not here. For prohibition was the one that came to mind for me, because there's at least at first, because there's no document about prohibition in there at all. So you could talk about that as an important cultural change in the 1920s. It's completely outside the documents. If you mention Great Migration, you're really putting that first document in its proper historical situation. You're not really giving us outside information, because the documents sort of hint you at that. So try to think about things that are not in the documents at all, or almost an additional document is kind of one way to think about it. So, and we're going to talk on Friday a little bit about sort of a strategy for laying out the essay. You're probably not going to get to 5 paragraphs in 30 minutes of writing. Maybe 3 paragraphs is better. Your intro with your thesis and your contextualization, your background, or your setting up kind of paragraph, and then a couple of body paragraphs. So probably a good rule of thumb might be 1 piece of outside information per body paragraph
Mhm.
to try to get to that at least minimum. So
All right. And then somebody else wanted us to clarify the distinction between referencing the documents and using them to support an argument. Remember, referencing is where you say in document such and such, the author is, that's referencing the document. Or if you put some sort of quotes or takes a pull an exact a very specific piece of information where you write it down verbatim as it is inside of the document, that is referencing the document. Using it to support an argument, that's where your hip part is kind of coming in. That's where you're actually analyzing what you think the document is trying to say, and then bringing it towards, your argumentation of what you're, to support your thesis statement. So I know, I know somebody else kind of mentioned the fact that there is DBQs are a little bit difficult. They're not really sure where to start. They don't understand them. Understand that DBQs are very difficult to write, and this is just a rough draft. So don't feel bad if you don't quite get it right away. Sometimes it can kind of, the inspiration can hit you as you're kind of looking at things. So don't feel like, oh, I should just know everything there is to know about DBQs. I mean, even as teachers, we learn new stuff all the time. So don't assume that, you know, just because it seems like other students in your class may know a little bit more about DBQs. It's just something where you're really going to have to practice. So if you are
yeah.
worried about it, I would definitely take some time to practice. They have the practice questions on in AP Classroom. You have the practice platform, and we'll put those links back up for you guys, so you definitely can look at that. But just practice and reach out to your teachers and ask questions. Now's a great time for them to kind of help walk you through this and kind of tell you, to kind of steer you into the right direction. Do not
Yeah.
wait until Thursday of next week. Please go
Yes.
ahead and do it now, and just kind of say, these are some questions, these are some things I've really been kind of struggling with, so that we'll know, they'll know exactly where you guys are.
And just a quick example for that first question about using a document. So if we think about that Fannie Hurst document, the woman who's suggesting that, women should be able to do basically whatever they want, not just be stuck in the home. If we're making the argument that the role of women changing is one of the most important cultural changes of the period, we would point to that as a piece of evidence to say, here's one person in that time period that was advocating that very viewpoint, that some people like her were suggesting that women had a role outside the house. It wasn't just being a housewife, not just cooking the meal for the husband when they came home. Some women were challenging that traditional point of view. And then you could talk about flappers and all that kind of thing, as opposed to saying, well, Fannie Hurst said in this document, blah, 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 blah. That's not really giving us the argument piece of it. So think about if you were trying to argue with your parents that your curfew should be later. What would be evidence that you would use to support that? You wouldn't, you know, it's kind of, what's the proof? Well, if you let me stay out later, I promise I'm going to do my homework and I'll be better at this or whatever. So, so citing the document, as Ms. Farr said, is just kind of referencing it or quoting it. We're using it as part of an argument. You're saying, well, this is a really important change in the 1920 in this time period, and here's a reason why.
All right. All right, guys. You guys are doing awesome. Thank you for all the wonderful questions. We wanted to kind of bring these back up to you, the idea of themes, and just kind of give you a friendly reminder about the fact that they are connective tissues of the course that enable you to create meaningful connections across units. And really kind of thinking about broader ideas and how they kind of run interweaving in between that. And I know you guys probably talked about this at the beginning of the year when you first got it, but just kind of wanted to show you these friendly reminders that these are your themes that you're working with. And you're probably going to be working with multiple themes within a given time period as you're kind of writing with that.
So think about which theme is this question, right? If we think about the prompt of the question, which theme are we working in primarily? It's probably American and regional culture. They're asking about why culture's developed and changed, as well as how culture is shaped. There's a little bit of migration sort of sprinkled in there too, with the Great Migration and immigration. So those are the two sort of main themes of this question. And the reason that we show you this is because on the next screen, we're going to talk a little bit about complexity.
Okay.
And so if you want to, thinking about that portion of the rubric, to write a more complex essay, there's, again, lots of different ways to do that. So just like we talked about with the, with the hip, you can do multiple different ways of getting that across. So being more complex might be corroborating by giving evidence from other themes to support it. So I gave you a couple of examples here. So the question is really about what was the most important cause of cultural change. You might bring in something from different themes to help support that argument, to show it's not just the cultural stuff that's changing, it's these other things that are changing as well. And please remember, the complexity, you can't just tack it on the end of your essay. It's not like it used to be in the course. I won't even use the word that we used to use to refer to it because I don't want to confuse you. But so complexity corroborating is one way to do that. Use information from other themes or from other places in the world. If you could make some connection to how culture was changing in Europe or in Asia, or if you knew some things from world or European history, you can do that with this. The second possible way of doing complexity is to modify or qualify. Are there ways that culture didn't change in the time period? Could we argue that something was more significant than the cultural changes of that time period? And that's a pretty astute student that's going to be able to pull that off. I mean, that's a tough question. The tricky thing with that one, and I know with my own students, we kind of played around with this idea in class. They were afraid of getting off topic, and that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind. You don't want to write an essay that you feel like you should write, then it's completely off the topic. It doesn't really address the prompt. That's kind of important. So so qualify might be say, okay, well, here's all the things that changed, but here are all the things that didn't change, or some of the things that didn't change. That shows that you understand there's more than one side to the story. Or kind of giving the other the counter thesis, as some people refer to it. And then can you provide nuance? For example, different levels of change for different elements. So with this question, it's asking, the relative significance. Are you giving that, this is the most important and here are the reasons why, but this is the second most important and here are the reasons why. And then this one really isn't important at all, and here's the reasons why that, which shows a little bit more sort of shade of meaning. One of the days that I did a DBQ review with you a few days ago, you might remember that the graphic of the color red, all the different sort of shades of red. So it's, does your essay do that? So these are more complex arguments. So some things to think about with that, if you, as we're getting sort of towards the end here.
Okay. So Other things to kind of think about with the complexity point as you're looking at this is, remember, this is in your rubric. This was the very last bullet point where it talks about corroborate, modify slash qualify, or those things. So remember that your rubric is going to be very important. You're going to actually need to be writing to the rubric and kind of stick to that. If it gives you a specific time period, make sure you stay within the parameters of that time period. Don't start writing about something in 1960 if they're telling you between 1914 and 1945. Those are just kind of things that you need to kind of remember. And as you're interweaving, I know a lot of people have asked the questions of, how can I bring in historical context and complexity in my paragraphs? It needs to make sense. There's really like no set way that you can, I would definitely say some people can bring it into each of their body paragraphs. You can put it into your conclusion. Just kind of make sure if you want to reference outside information that you kind of put it in a place that it makes sense. Don't just stick things in there just to kind of randomly start talking about outside information because you want to get that point. It
Mhm.
needs to make sense and it needs to attest to what it is that you're writing about. So kind of keep that in mind as you're getting it together. And I'm going to remind you over and over again, this is a rough draft. This is not going to be a perfect essay. So please stop focusing in on how can I make the perfect essay and focus in on how can I best answer this question and best take these documents and make them work for me. I think a lot of you are trying to write this perfect essay, and in 45 minutes, it's impossible with a rough draft. So
Right.
you may make some mistakes, and it's okay. Be okay with making mistakes.
Yep.
But what you have to make sure that you're doing is that you are writing to the rubric. That is the most important part. So, my suggestion, and I've always said this to students, is keep a copy of the rubric beside you so that you can make sure you can check off. Yes, check, check, check. I did this. I've made sure that I've hit all of that. So we have
Yep.
provided the rubric for you guys in our on our to our Twitter people in our Twitterverse. If you need us to put it back up there, we are happy to do so. But just make sure that you know what that rubric says and you're actually writing to the rubric.
And they've told us you'll have access to that. That's that bulleted list that goes right with the prompt. So
Yeah.
that's what that is. So like Ms. Farr said, I tell my students the same thing. Use that as your checklist. When you think you're you got 5 minutes left to go, double check, reread through that bulleted list. Did I do this? Did I do that? Because you don't have to memorize that rubric. It's going to be there for you to try to remember all the different parts. There's a lot of parts to this question.
Yeah.
Um,
And DBQs take time. So don't panic. That's why we're telling you to practice.
yep.
All right. So we talked about those important links. Wanted to bring that back up with you. So if you don't want to take a picture of this very quickly, these are the things. Definitely, definitely, definitely. If you haven't done so, go to the demo site and practice uploading the different ways. If you want to copy and paste, if you want to write it out and save it as a file, or if you want to write it out and then take a picture of it, just kind of remember that. Make sure you look at number 3 for your required or recommended docs that you need to have for exam day. Make sure to keep this checklist. It has been recommended that students actually have a copy of the checklist every time they go to take their exam,
Yep.
just to keep yourself really kind of going through it. And, we don't usually assign homework. I know some other other AP virtual classrooms, they have been doing that. But one of the things we definitely want you guys to do for us is do number 6, please. The 5 steps before exam video. Please watch this video and really kind of go through this, because we do not want to have anything that will hinder you from being able to have your exam scored. So if there's ever a thing that we assign you to do, this will
Yeah.
be the one thing that we would really prefer for you guys to do, is to actually do that 5 steps before an exam video. It's going to be very important. And then
And
of course,
one of those
oh, go ahead.
steps is that exam demo site. So
Mm-hmm.
that's again really important because this is a very different year. So being comfortable with that process of, okay, here's what I'm going to do on exam day. I'm going to handwrite my response and upload the picture. No, I'm going to actually do it as a separate window. I'm going to type in a Google Doc and I'm going to just cut and paste it over. That you can practice that as many times as you want to. So that will
Mm-hmm.
hopefully help to reduce some of your anxiety before test day. That,
Right.
okay, I've been through that. I know what I'm doing now with that part of it. I can focus on those documents and that hip stuff that Ms. Farr and Mr. Horton have been talking about for
Right.
a month.
Right. And I mean, based off of what we've seen from you guys from the last month or so, you guys are going to do great. I mean,
Yeah.
you guys have been rocking it out with the responses. Your teachers should be very proud of you. Speaking of teachers, so we put this post out and asked you to shout out your teachers for Teacher Appreciation Week. And normally during the school time, you're able to kind of show your appreciation in person, but unfortunately, due to everything that's been happening, it's kind of hard to do that. So this is not all of the teachers who've been shout out, but thank you for responding. But to these teachers at these schools, and it's impossible for us to go through this list, but we just wanted to let you guys know that your students love you. Thank you for having them support us and our efforts in presenting this virtual instruction. I know this is kind of a different platform. And thank you to the students for recognizing that your teachers rock. Thank you for the little quotes that you put by about how they make learning fun, about how they really make a push. You can tell that they really care. So all of these teachers here, they are rock stars, and the students that you teach, they're awesome and amazing as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Hats off to all of them.
right. And Mr. Horde, do you have anything that you want to add?
No, I think we're good for today. I think we're gonna do the same process
Mhm,
tomorrow and Thursday. We're gonna try another practice question tomorrow. Ms. Farr
mhm,
and I will be back on Thursday to do the same thing. We're gonna review all of that, and then
mhm.
Friday we have some surprises lined up for you. So you'll have to tune in on Friday.
Right. So again, we know how we're telling you guys about, what's the best way to prepare for this practice. So tomorrow you have another opportunity. It's going to be a totally different question. So make sure you get in there early so that you can get access to the documents. And Mr. Horton's going to be your proctor tomorrow. So it should be great. So hopefully, those of you who had a little anxiety with the first one, hopefully this kind of calmed you down. But don't worry, we'll be back with you again on Thursday to walk you through everything. So
Yep. Yep.
thanks, you guys. Thanks for
Yep.
all the questions that you've had on Twitter. We really appreciate it. You guys have a great day.
Yep. Thanks. See ya.
Bye.